Hello, everybody. Hopefully you can all see me. So let me begin by saying a big welcome back to everyone, to all of those who were able to join us yesterday and the day before, and to those joining us for the first time because you weren't able to make the first couple of days, another big welcome and hello. I'm Jeff Ross, and I have the honour of being one of the conference directors for the Beyond Multiple Choice conference screen. And let me please share my screen and we can start proceedings, hopefully. Yes. Yeah, lovely, thank you. Right, so I'm going to kick things off in a few, over the next few minutes with a bit of administration before we start the day's proceedings properly with our esteemed opening address of the day. And I'll be popping up, as I have been throughout the last couple of days, I'll be popping up throughout today between various sessions to provide us the continuity and the continuation of things going, to keep you up to date with any announcements, timings, for plans and so on that we have throughout the day, and hopefully to engage with everybody on the various panels. For those of you in the various time zones of the world, we are going to be working in our timings on Eastern Standard Time. So bear in mind that all the timings will be in Eastern Time. Okay, I'd like to take the opportunity of thanking all of our sponsors who have made this welcome. It's through their kindness and generosity and foresight in sponsoring the event that we're able to offer it free to everybody. And I just wanted to give them a big round of thanks. I also want to thank all of our speakers, our contributors who have put a lot of time and effort and present to us some expertise and some really fascinating insights into this whole world of computer-based assessment and digital assessment. We welcome social media comments and inputs on our hashtag #BMC assessments and at BMC 2022, and we want to make the conference as much an interactive event as possible. So as I've been saying over the last couple of days, and I'll repeat no doubt more than once today, please use the chat box. We want your comments, we want your questions. Each of the chairs of the sessions will try to take those questions and relate them to the presenters and to the speakers, and hopefully we can get some kind of dialogue going between you and them and amongst ourselves on the various subjects of the conference today. And we have a very full program, presentations and discussions and demonstrations for you today. All our sessions are being recorded and we'll be making them available on Catch Up through our website and through YouTube. So look out for the link that will send all the delegates next week. So if you have to miss out on any of today's, or you want to see any of today's presentations again, or pick up on the previous 2 days, the link will be your link in and you'll be able to see them again. And there's a lot of people who have registered for the conference in parts of the world where we're now moving into the evening, if not the night. So we know we have a lot of people who watch this on Catch Up. And for those of watching this on Catch Up in particularly, hi, and I hope you enjoy the rest of today. Obviously, the chat room doesn't apply for you. It's too late, but we are welcoming through the social media your comments, your questions, and so on. And I'm going to do one final last big thank you to the technical team in the States who have made this broadcast possible, and through his hard work, we're able to present the conference today on this Zoom webinar link. Finally, we'll be sending out a feedback form at some stage next week. It's only a few short questions. We really appreciate your input. We really appreciate your thoughts. We've been doing this for quite some time, but the shape and the format and the content and the context of the conference very much reflects the inputs we receive on those feedback forms and on the comments after the event. And it does help us shape what these future conferences look like and cover. So, the shape of today, very quickly, we've got our keynote speaker, will then followed by a special session demonstration. Our next big session of the day will then follow. And we'll take a short break of about 30 minutes or so in order so people can catch up with emails and all of that kind of thing. We'll then come back in the afternoon, Eastern time, with a first special session of the afternoon demonstration, followed by a big session and our closing keynote. And our aim is to finish about 3 p.m. Eastern time. Again, that reference to Eastern time, 3 p.m. local time, Washington and East Coast of the States. So, without much further ado, I'm going to invite our opening speaker to step forward and share with us her thoughts on some of these cultural and social issues around e-assessment and assessment of students, under the title, Leveraging Stakeholders to Develop Culturally Responsive Assessment That's Reflective of Student Culture and Experiences. So Fiona Hinds is an accomplished strategic educational executive leader, and she's a passionate and she's an influential voice for equity and social justice. In addition to previously working as a senior advisor at Cognia, she's Chief Strategy Officer for Women in Measurement, a non-profit organization devoted to amplifying and supporting diverse representation of all women in the educational measurement field. Questions and answers we'll take after Fiona's presentation. Please use the chat box. So without further ado, I'm now delighted to ask Fiona to, whatever this is in the digital world, to digitally step forward and take her presentation. I understand that Brian will actually run the presentation on the screen on behalf of Fiona, and I'll be back at the end of that, questions and answers, time permitting. Thanks everybody, and over to you, Fiona.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, yeah, fine.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Good day, everyone. Thank you so much, Beyond Multiple Choice, for the invitation to present today on leveraging stakeholders to develop culturally responsive assessment that is reflective of student culture and experiences. Certainly, this topic is near and dear to me. I started my career as a teacher and school principal in Detroit, and I am so looking forward to talking about engaging communities in order to support the transformation of assessment. Next slide. So I'm going to divide this session up into 3 parts, and that is, we'll start with culturally responsive assessment. And why do we need culturally responsive assessment? What does it mean? And how do we leverage communities to understand student culture and experiences? The studies that I will share will provide an example of working with educators, for example, in Boston Public Schools, to develop an 8th grade ELA culturally responsive form. And also study 2, I'll discuss a collaborative process and framework that was developed by a team of industry practitioners, consultants, and university representation to explore culture as a method to support and engage communities to design the adaptation of a 6th grade math assessment. Next slide. First and foremost, students are at the center of our work, and with a specific focus on understanding that cultural connections and experiences are significant to providing opportunities to demonstrate learning in the context that supports valuing who they are. For the first time in US history, classrooms in public schools have the majority of students enrolled who are students of color. However, the gap in disparities among Black, Brown, and Indigenous students continues to plague our school systems and educational practices. Students of color are still in under-resourced schools where they lack access to high-level courses such as AP classes and enrichment opportunities, quality materials, and adequate facilities. These resource inequities also are evident through too many students of color being held to lower academic standards and being subjected to harsh and numerous disciplinary actions. These and other barriers result in academic performance that serve to limit students' life opportunities. Next slide. One of the things that we can do is to center identity and culture in learning and assessment practices. Research shows student performance improves when students are engaged and provided with contextually appropriate connections between the content, culture, and their lived experiences. Grounding the content in students' culture and own real life experiences not only makes it relevant for them, but also easier for them to connect and demonstrate their knowledge. Students of color should have the chance to see themselves in the materials of curriculum and assessments. Historically, content development and item writing for standardized large-scale interim assessments and standardized assessments in general have purposely eliminated culturally specific language. This idea that cultural context can be removed is an incorrect assertion, as Resnick and Resnick point out. The belief that we can decontextualize our assessment is an outdated assumption about the nature of competence that continues to perpetuate dominant culture, white-centered items. Jennifer Randall describes this notion of white-centered items in her article, Color Neutral is Not a Thing. Dr. Randall argues there's no such thing as color neutral. Rather than trying to strip and remove cultural context from our assessments, an approach that would be more closely aligned to the science of learning would be to seek to meaningfully connect the items to familiar reference points and important aspects of students' lives. Next slide. Culturally relevant pedagogy. The concept and theories around cultural relevance certainly emerged in the mid-1990s. We're seeing a resurgence of this over the last few years. However, Gloria Latson-Billings came up with the term culturally relevant pedagogy to describe the importance of teaching to and through the cultural strengths of Black, Brown, and Indigenous students. Such scholars as Latson-Billings argued for the use of cultural relevant pedagogy to actively engage and motivate students from diverse backgrounds in order to improve their academic achievement. Later, numerous scholars started to argue that student learning can be more effectively assessed by using assessment approaches that are culturally responsive. This connection influenced others while making an integrative approach to teaching, learning, and assessment, and the impact of demonstrating learning through the lens of Black, Brown, and Indigenous cultures. Next slide. The underpinnings of the studies that engage educators and frame a process for developing culturally responsive assessment within a larger group of stakeholder representation frames this work. We intentionally seek to create items that connect to and affirm the cultures and identities of students in order to empower those students that have been marginalized and historically underrepresented. This topic is under-researched, and we have set out to support and explore a test design that engages student cultures and identities to better support how they demonstrate what they know and the connectedness to their value of culture and identity. Next slide. Jennifer Randall argues that by not attending to student identities in items that and by focusing on neutral items, there is a systemic frame that marginalizes students of color and diminishes their opportunity to truly demonstrate what they know and what they can do. Each student brings their own cultural context to every testing experience. And when those contexts are misaligned with the test, with the questions, with the items, with the content, this actually threatens the validity of the, also threatens the validity of the interpretations. Next slide. Dr. Stuart Wells provides context for dismantling inequities for students of color by providing culturally responsive assessment items that are specifically designed to recognize the brilliance of Black, Brown, and Indigenous children, and that interrupts the systems that have marginalized and criminalized these students in the classroom. Next slide. The proposed studies that I'd like to share, they aim to explore new methods for assessment developers to partner with community stakeholders in order to support the development of items that are reflective of student cultures and lived experiences. Based upon the premise that standardized test items currently do not provide students with equal opportunities to demonstrate what they know and can do. These two studies seek to understand both the extent to which we can successfully reflect student culture within standardized ELA and math items, and also the effects this may have on student experiences. Both of these studies were led by principal investigator Dr. Susan Lyons in collaboration with Boston Public School educators for the first study and Western New Mexico and assessment development staff for the second study. These studies highlight community engagement, working with teachers, working with the community, working with academics. Through the process of reflecting a vision that moves towards a more just, more socially just oriented assessment system. This process with both Boston Public Schools and the collaboration with other assessment leaders supports and informs a change in practice. Next slide. The goal of this research with Boston Public Schools was set out to understand how the district-wide standardized multiple choice assessments might be able, for ELA 8th grade, might be able to better support the learning of all students by recognizing and engaging with the backgrounds and identities of the student body. This study was planned as an experimental mixed method study design that relied on assessment and survey data to gather information on student test taking and performance and experiences. The plan also included follow-up focus groups to provide additional qualitative insight into the quantitative findings. Due to difficulty recruiting educators during a surge in Boston Public Schools of COVID-19 Omicron early in 2022, we were unable to reach our target sample size and instead implemented a fully qualitative study. The paper, which can be found on Lyons Assessment Consulting website, focuses on the process and outcomes associated with developing the culturally responsive, justice-oriented ELA assessment with engagement from a dedicated group of Boston Public School educators. Survey and focus group results revealed that students were able to identify with the people in the reading passages and able to make connections with the reading passages and their own lives. The process of assessment development employed for this study represents a departure from current industry practices in standardized assessment development, and therefore has the potential for far-ranging implications and support for assessment innovations within the district and beyond, including potential impact for standardized assessment programs and processes. It's important to note that while working with BPS, they had already undertaken efforts to update passages in benchmark assessments to reflect cultural, racial, and socioeconomic diversity within the student body. The research study explores the feasibility of a more deeply connected or of more deeply connecting to the specific cultures and identities of the students served in the district by collaborating directly with the teachers to create relevant passages for use in the benchmark assessment program. The intention was for the passages to go beyond diversity and align specifically with the district goals to develop an anti-racist system that values all students, attends to the particular socio-political realities of the community, and empowers students. The culturally relevant items that were developed within the context of this study was only one component of the larger vision to create an assessment system that supports anti-racism and social justice for all students. We had two research questions. How can we leverage educator knowledge of their students to develop assessment items that attend to cultures, identities, and lived experiences of the students in Boston Public Schools? Our second research question, what impacts do culturally responsive items have on students' test-taking experiences and performance? Our hypothesis was that by engaging with teachers dedicated to supporting culture and identity for learning, we would be able to develop assessments that are responsive to the identities and experiences of students, and that we expected that as a result, engaging with these assessments, that students would feel valued and be able to more easily demonstrate their knowledge and skills. Additionally, because this is a departure from current industry practice in standardized assessment development, this study may have the potential to inform more far-reaching assessment innovations, including to impact standardized assessment programs. Next slide. So our first step in this process, and certainly one of the most important steps, was the process of identification of the passages. And for developing the culturally responsive assessment. And given the time that we had with volunteer teachers, as researchers, we started the process by, first of all, identifying the control form that was already being used for the benchmark assessment, and then identifying an assessment form that could be adapted so that it was reflective of culturally responsive, justice-oriented context with a paired passage and a theme, similar to the original control. When we started this, we prioritized that the text would be relatable and that would have a local Boston context. And so, for example, one of the passages that we selected was an excerpt from the Boston Globe, and it was about the life of a high school student in Massachusetts during the Omicron surge of the pandemic. And this article explored anxiety, schoolwork, the disruptions of the pandemic, and the confusion of conflicting messages as it relates to COVID. We also identified climate change as another topic theme, and we identified an excerpt from a speech from Greta Thunberg, as well as a specific article, again, from the Boston Globe that reflected young climate activists. The teachers were incredibly insightful and supportive of answering questions around the identities and the relatability to these particular themes and to these particular texts. Next slide. We asked the teachers these questions, and we focused specifically on conversations around understanding the relevance of these passages that were initially selected, and also ensuring that the people and contexts could be relatable for the students, and that there was some type of connection in their real lives as it related to those passages and the perspectives that were shared. We also talked about student identities and the identity of who they are, and the opportunity for them to be represented so that they can see themselves in the context of the passages that were selected. And while we were meeting with the teachers, they gave us really insightful feedback and really pushed us to go back and identify specific other articles and passages that would be more relatable to their students. The teachers that we were working with, the majority of the students were students of color, and they felt that we needed to go back and identify more representational texts that supported those students. And so we did that. And next slide. And we identified two other options. Option 3 was in regards to activism and generational activism. This, once again, we identified an article from the Boston Globe that we thought reflected the Boston experience. And we also identified the theme of youth activists of color. And we had a passage that was reflective of climate change as an issue of racial injustice, and also highlighting young activists of color. And the teachers did ultimately selected the passages that were more closely associated with their students. And they identified option 4, could go to the next slide, please. The young activists of color theme, and the titles of those passages relating to the connection of climate change and racial injustice, and also highlighting a young activist of color. Next slide. The next step in the process, and for the purposes of our research, was identifying and creating the items that would parallel the cognitive tasks and support the expectations of the benchmark assessment. So we had 2 primary goals for this development: to ensure, number 1, that the item construction was as parallel as possible to the control form, and that we would lean into the vision of the district and the vision of this work to create more of an anti-racist orientation towards the culturally relevant items that were developed. And generally, the conversations that we had during this process were very specific to balancing both ensuring that the comparability was parallel and that we were highlighting and supporting the vision of the district to identify culturally relevant items that also supported an anti-racist approach. Next slide. This is an example of one of the parallel questions that we were able to develop. And you'll see on the left-hand side, the original question in the original theme based on the coral reefs passages. And so this question specifically being about meaning, the meaning behind chain reaction, which was certainly one of the themes and one of the descriptions within this particular passage. And we were able to specifically parallel the question to this task and to the cognitive area that this supported with the climate change is racial injustice passage. And so here's where we focused on the meaning of the word injustice as it related to the context of this particular passage. And so we were able to identify and the comparability, as well as support the context for social justice, anti-racism, and incorporate this as a culturally relevant form. Item question. Next slide. At the end of the assessment, students were asked to reflect on very similar questions that we asked teachers in regards to the relatability of the text and their identification with the passages and the support and whether or not it was engaging, how much it reflected their own life experiences. And so they had an opportunity to respond to the survey, which was a Likert scale regarding the relatability, the relevance, the connectedness, and the experience related to their identity. Next slide. We also facilitated focus groups, and in these focus groups we engaged with students in April of 2022, and this was also assisted and supported by classroom teachers. We conducted these focus groups via Zoom, and our area, we had students who identified themselves, 80% of the students identified themselves as Black. All of the students identified themselves as people of color. So overall, the students found the culturally relevant assessment passages interesting and described the topics as relevant to their lives. Students believed that the texts that they connected with their lives were engaging and interesting. Specifically, students repeatedly referenced shared identities, identifying with the people and the subjects in the passages as a key aspect that made this assessment relatable, interesting, and also different from other assessments that they had been engaged in. Students also referenced how these passages actually compared to some of the passages and that they had previously engaged in the classroom and at the classroom level. The students also identified that they had not experienced this type of relatability in a standardized assessment, and that there were no other assessments per se that provided them with an opportunity to connect and see themselves within the context of that experience. Next slide. So within the context of the survey results, there were certainly, because of the limited number of the students that we had, and we were able to collect data around the survey results and felt very strongly that the insights that we received from the focus groups supported the students and their reflections, and provided us with additional insights into the specific ways that this newly developed assessment affected their testing experiences. And you'll notice that the survey results here were certainly demonstrate that we were successful in the sense of identifying and paralleling student experiences, as well as having some mixed results. And because we were unable to implement both the control and the culturally relevant assessment, we did not have the comparison data for performance. Next slide. So some of the lessons learned and the implications from this particular study include that students of color reported interest and engagement in the assessment, and that there was an opportunity for there to be a connection with identifying passages and item development that supported the district's vision of an anti-racist assessment system and items that would support meeting this vision. We were also able to support educators within the context of Boston Public Schools to contribute to a culturally relevant form that supported their understanding of the identities and cultures of their students, and that this provided an opportunity to create an assessment that students could be connected to. Next slide. The second study, and I'll just take a couple of minutes to wrap up here so that we do have some time for some questions. I would like to also just note that the concept that we used to engage educators in the assessment development process and the item development process really contributed to teachers who were already supporting the lens of not only increasing diversity in the context of the assessments that they provided to students, but also making the connection and bridging the connection to who students are. And so in this next study, one of the things that the aim specifically for this process was to engage community to develop culturally responsive assessment. And a part of the aim was to explore new methods for partnering with community stakeholders to develop assessment items that are reflective of student cultures and lived experiences. And so for the first phase of this particular research project, we developed a workshop and a specific protocol in order for us to engage with a school district or school districts in New Mexico, and to reflect deep conversation about local culture and socio-cultural context for students' lives. So the convening for this workshop that was developed would be a 2 half-day institute that would bring community stakeholders, including educators, district representatives, and also students and parents as a part of the workshop, and specifically designating time for students to participate in sections of the workshop so that we are leveraging in a meaningful way reflection and feedback from the students. So this purpose was to modify and adapt an existing grade 6 math interim assessment. And so we set out to explore a process, to identify a specific process that would support community engagement in this way. And so we developed a central focus on consulting with community members, including educators, students, and families, in order to support the process for understanding their culture and identity and their experience in their daily lives. So as a research team, we took about 5 months to engage and frame this workshop. Next slide. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Can you go back to the other slide? So thank you. So the research questions here, one, can we develop a process where content developers can successfully partner with community stakeholders to adapt math items to faithfully represent the context of students' lives? And then number 2, what is the impact of culturally relevant math item stimuli on student testing experiences and performance? This particular study, in terms of the workshop and addressing the first research question will be implemented in January 2023. And the implementation of the culturally responsive assessment based on this work with the community will be implemented in 2023, in the spring of 2023. And so one of the things, next slide, please. Thank you. One of the things that we know, we took a collaborative approach to this workshop design with an in-depth review of relevant resources, as well as a collective understanding of how the research fits into the broader landscape of culturally relevant assessment in math education. And one of the things that we understand is that when we are working with communities to help inform assessment, we're providing an opportunity to connect with the funds of knowledge that are specifically related to integrating experiences and activities that are lived in the families and in the communities that we will serve, and leveraging a strength-based perspective that supports the cultural context and the rich resources that families and communities can draw from. Next slide. So in addition to grounding ourselves in the literature, we also went through a process of recognizing challenges associated with going into a community and establishing a workshop process and facilitating a process. What we understood through this work was that we needed to build a process that would establish trust and openness with the stakeholders that we were working with. And so we acknowledged and identified our own positionality as outsiders coming into this community, and also as perceived levels of power dynamics that we have, whether that was through our own identities, whether it was through our affiliation, through the university, our education, and also our specific identities that may be different from the community itself. And so this development process focused on who we are as researchers and what we bring through our positionality, and how we can establish an environment of trust and openness through gathering information and supporting listening to understand culture. Next slide. We use this iceberg actually as one of our frameworks to understanding culture, and that is moving from the visible levels of food, festivals, holidays, to wanting to understand the deeper level of culture, which relates to values and beliefs and approaches, whether that's with communication styles or family values. And we use this framework as an understanding of how we move forward with engaging with community to understand that deep level of culture. Next slide. And so we set out, we had three main purposes for this workshop. And these purposes were specifically to understand community experience with the educational process as it related to curriculum instruction and assessment. And we also wanted to make sure that we had a common ground when it came to what this research study is all about, and that we were transparent about how this would be used and how this could support the advancement of creating assessments that are more culturally relevant. And then, of course, this engagement was specifically also to support understanding how to incorporate the context of students' everyday lives into the assessment items that we were writing. And finally, next slide, these are the intended outcomes. And as I mentioned, this workshop will be delivered and we will be engaging in this workshop in January. And we're expecting to have engagement from the community. We're expecting to be able to adapt the current assessment form to be a culturally responsive sixth grade math form, and also a process that can be documented for working with communities as partners in the context of development. Next slide. And to wrap up, we see there are potential implications of this work, and that the results of this study has the potential to disrupt the current standard operating procedure for test development and to develop a practice for culturally responsive assessment. We're also looking at this as an opportunity to model and this as an exploration, but to also continue to develop this and refine a process for partnering with communities so that we can represent social cultural contexts as it relates to student experiences. All right, and next slide, please. Okay, and if I'm not sure how much time we have, and I'm going to look at the chat now. I haven't necessarily been looking at the chat, but I'd just like to thank you all for engaging in this discussion and for considering what it means to support students of color with culturally responsive assessment.
Okay, Fiona, really, really interesting. Some big subjects in there and some very interesting ones. And this is the sound of me applause on behalf of the audience. Yes, we've got quite a few questions which I'll go through in a moment. And I am vaguely aware of the slight irony of here I am, the white Anglo-Saxon male, asking questions on the subject. But I think it's something which is really relevant and important to everybody in the industry. So I'm going to take some of these questions, if I may, and present them to you. So I'll start off with, which I thought was a really good question from Raphael to begin with. Do you have any insight into how we could synthesize readability and accessibility with cultural responsive assessment items?
Great question. I think that, there are definitely schools of thought around levels of readability and accessibility, as well as culturally responsive items. And one of the things that we know is that when students are connected and engaged with the content, they're more likely to be motivated. They're more likely to be interested in the content and interested in the opportunity to be able to reflect and demonstrate what they know through the lens of that content, because of the connectedness and because of the relationship that when they are valued within this context. And so I think that there are layers to the question that you're asking. And I would share that I think that it's really important that we provide these opportunities so that the accessibility, I see accessibility also as one of the layers to the entry points of being related to and being able to connect to the information, and then being able to turn that into demonstrating what I know and demonstrating what I can do as a student through that lens, and that type of accessibility is also a part of the cultural relevance framework.
Okay, that's brilliant. What I'm going to do, Fiona, is the official time is sort of coming to an end, but I'm going to extend the session, if I may, to do a few more of these questions, with my apologies to the speakers coming up. We have got a bit of freedom in the schedule. They don't tell the other speakers I said that. So I'm going to take a few more questions, if I may indulge in your time for a little bit longer. And there was one came through from Juan. Practical question, very practical question, I think. What was the impact of the work on the assessment scores? What was the reflection, the actual achievements of the kids that went through this process?
So for the, that's a great question. And I think that question comes up quite a bit because I think there are a couple of perspectives in terms of what it means as it relates to cultural relevance and performance. So our initial design for the work that we did with Boston Public Schools, we wanted to be able to compare how well students did on the control form, which was the form based on coral reefs, and also the cultural relevant form, which was based on social injustice and racial injustice and climate change. And we were unable to do that just because of the numbers. And so the students did not take both forms. They specifically took the culturally relevant form, the students who were allowed to be a part of the study. And so we don't have a comparison as to whether or not, which I think is a part of the question that you're asking, whether or not they would have done better based on comparable cognitive tasks and having a culturally relevant form versus the control form. And one of the things that I think is also important, and I think there are two schools of thought. There's the school of thought that students should be able to see themselves in the content and reflect it. And if they do the same as they did on the control form, that is an opportunity to empower students and to support students with their own understanding and connectivity to culturally sustaining content. And then there's also the thought that, well, if cultural relevance is effective, students are going to do better. What we know is that students are more engaged when their cultural relevance they're connected to that. And when students are more engaged with the learning process, they definitely achieve higher. And so it is something that certainly we are tracking and continue to engage in terms of being able to do some type of comparability with an original form and the cultural relevant form, which is something that we certainly look forward to doing with the second study, where we hope to have a much larger group participate.
Talking about measuring actual scores and so on, I'm not going to ask you where you think we'll be in 5 to 10 years, because I think that's an impossible question. How do we measure? Do you have any views on how we might measure success in this process?
Great question. Well, I think that I think there's a qualitative and quantitative aspect to that. I think that when students feel valued and when students are empowered and supported, and when we begin to change the trajectory because of supporting Black, Brown, and Indigenous students, because they have an opportunity to see themselves and they have an opportunity to connect and build their capacity for empowerment through what we provide, I think there's a measure of success there, that their experiences with the assessment is a measure of success, and that those experiences are being reflected within that context, that's a part of this journey. Another part of this journey is that this is one piece of supporting removing and decreasing the inequities and disparities that children of color experience in school. And I think that as we remove those barriers, that we will see a trajectory that increases the levels of achievement, increases the way we think about how students demonstrate what they know and what they can do, and that it's a part of a holistic framework to balance and encourage and decrease the amount of inequities and barriers that Black, Brown, and Indigenous students face.
Lovely. Thank you. I'm going to continue with a couple more of the questions and just keep an eye on the clock. Was there concern about the content being emotionally troubling or provoking stress or distress during the assessment? Was this discussed with the focus groups and survey? If so, how was it should be addressed during the test experience? I think stress and distress during the process is a really interesting area.
Yeah. So I think, well, during the discussions with teachers, so I mentioned that one of the paired items was about the pandemic and the experience in Massachusetts of this resurgence of COVID related to the Omicron strand. And the teachers identified that as something that could be disturbing because students had lost family members, teachers were out of school. So teachers did identify it within that context and with those paired passages. And I mention that because, on the other hand, most often underrepresented and marginalized students have not had the opportunity to see themselves within the process of learning and the educational framework. Sometimes the opportunity to be able to see experiences that students have had is affirming. And sometimes those experiences can be stressful or disturbing. What we're discovering, and West Ed also has done research on student engagement and getting feedback from students, and more what they find, the things that adults identify as sensitive or disturbing were not sensitive or disturbing to the students themselves. So I think that we have to work at understanding what that looks like and what that means for students versus adults making those decisions as to what they can handle and what they can't handle. And sometimes, even when we look at the list of things that we often eliminate from the content of our assessment, often that eliminates authors of color and people of color's experiences. And so this is certainly something that we are supporting in the context of understanding what makes the most sense for students to be validated and to be supported, and to discover with them what would be what's the most relatable and the least amount of sort of disturbing sensitivity. Although I think those criteria need to change in order for us to truly reflect students' lives and for them to be able to experience themselves through the process.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? There's a I think maybe the last question, maybe we'll get two more in. From Manalina, are there any rubrics that you follow to design inclusive assessments? And what the question states is, by inclusive, she means either culturally inclusive or disability inclusive as well. And there's also, as I think we all say, thank you for sharing your experiences. But I think that's quite interesting, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That you've got two almost parallel streams here, and she was asking if there were rubrics for trying to increase or include these together.
Right. So we certainly use standards of practice with our expert item developers. And I think that we focused specifically on cultural relevance. And I would like to add, when we consider students and different learning styles and students with disabilities, I think it's important for us to note that more often students of color are identified and are in those programs, as well as identified for special education and for special education services. We did not focus specifically on that area. We dove into the research behind cultural relevance, behind cultural sustainability and funds of knowledge, and really cultivated identifying how to elicit information about culture in order to incorporate levels of cultural relevance within the content itself.
Lovely. Thank you for that. And thank you for the whole presentation. I'm going to take this is the opportunity for bringing the session to the end with, as I said, thank you to our delegates for their questions as well. I'm sure if you don't mind me volunteering, I'm sure you're happy to take questions on and feedback which may well continue beyond the course of this event. I'm sure it will. I'm very tempted to say, can we invite you back for an update in a year or so's time to see how the progress and how these things are developing. I think it's a very interesting time that we're in at the moment. Great presentation. So thank you ever so much, Fiona. I won't ask everybody to applaud, but I'll do a short applaud, and look forward to meeting you again, hopefully.
Thank you. And thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, then. Right. Am I still online? Yes.
Hi, Jeff. You're good.
Right. Thank you, Brian. And my apologies for keeping you waiting, and my apologies to the other speakers in the session following you that we've maybe pushed back a few minutes, but we have got time in the schedule, so we try and make use of those. So we come now to the next session, a special session, following up from Brian's earlier presentation. I've asked him to come back and actually demonstrate and show how this whole area of concept mapping looks once it's on the screen. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Brian. I shall stop sharing my stop sharing my screen. That's not easy to say with the new teeth in. Okay, and leave you in his very.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Jeff, can I just do a sound check?
I can hear you. Yep.
All right. Sounds great. I will try to get us a bit back on in terms of the time schedule, but we did have a one person in our next special session who wasn't able to be here today, so we've got a little extra time. What I want to do, again, as Jeff said, follow up on Tuesday's talk, which was more of an introduction just to concept mapping generally, is to talk a bit about what we're doing with our concept mapping learning assessment tool, Sero. And what I want to sort of base this in, loosely base it in the NAEP science framework. That's one of the things that inspired us to go down this path of developing Sero. And talk to you a bit about how we've done it and some of the advantages and disadvantages thereof. I think you all know me by now, co-host of the conference, President Sero Learning Assessments, and our book, Applied Concept Mapping, which I wrote with, edited with Joe Novak and others. So for those who weren't here Tuesday, just a brief update on the talk from Tuesday to talk about what are concept maps. If you've never seen a concept map, this is what it looks like. You'll notice that the concept map itself answers a focus question, and I'll come back to this notion of focus question. But if we have a focus question, for instance, of how do molecules build the world, here's a pretty basic concept map. The key features are the concepts, the linking phrases that connect those concepts to other concepts, and the arrowheads that show how that concept, linking phrase, concept, or proposition should be read. It's basically a hierarchy. It's not a strict hierarchy because we have things like cross links. So those key features of concept mapping are actually what we use in order to introduce concept mapping as an assessment. Keep all these features in mind because you're going to see them later. Building up these organized sets of propositions then allows us to create concept maps, which are meaningful diagrams of mental models. Back to the focus question, talked about this a bit on Tuesday. So there are evidence-based differences between what sort of concept maps people might develop given a focus question that's either static or dynamic. In this case, this example, what are the parts of the solar system? You might expect the parts to comprise the map, whereas a more dynamic question, how do parts of the solar system affect life on Earth? You would expect a more interactive set of propositions that talk about how these different parts of the solar system affect parts of the Earth. Propositions, as I said, were this concept, linking phrase, concept, that differentiates concept mapping from other diagramming tools like mind maps, where the linking phrase is not specified. We also, in particular with Sero, are explicit about this arrowhead in the proposition. So that tells somebody which direction to read the proposition. So Earth revolves around the sun creates a true proposition, whereas if that arrowhead was going the other way, that would be a false proposition. So I want to switch out of Sero talk and look at the NAEP science framework, in particular how it recommends and has recommended actually for quite some time that concept mapping be used as an assessment item. So if we go over to the, I got to get my bar out of the way. There we go. If we just take a look at the NAEP framework for science, this is a national level assessment and grades 4, 8, and 12. And the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the science framework, includes concept mapping as an interactive computer task. I just excerpted from the NAEP some of the pieces of the framework which talk about concept mapping. It is described again as an interactive computer task, even suggests sort of what the task might look like. Obviously, this is a bit of an older view of tools, but the concept's the same. And so the idea is that a focus question can be given. You can provide the concepts and the linking labels or not. That's kind of an optional piece. And then more description about how this can be set up, how it can be scored, is given in the framework. The other place that the concept mapping appears is in the specifications. This goes back to 2009, and it's my understanding that, at least for the concept mapping piece, this is the most recent version of the specification. And so, again, described in terms of what concept maps provide in terms of their value, and then how you can set them up. So here's another representation. Again, the idea is pretty much the same: concepts and linking phrases, with the task being to provide the concepts and linking phrases or some combination thereof for the students to create a concept map from content given. There is in here also a description of a task where the concept map is only provided in terms of the concepts, and then the students can create their map from those concepts by creating the hierarchical or not always hierarchical view of the propositions, but add their own linking phrases. So even within the NAEP, you can see a couple of different iterations on how this can be done. And as you can also see, if you read closely, this is an evidence-based practice. So this research in doing this sort of thing has been around for 30, 40 years. And the NAEP is, to my knowledge, the best place where using concept mapping as an assessment strategy, in this case for a national assessment, has been specified to this level. So that's what the NAEP has suggested. Again, to my knowledge, you doing this sort of thing has not been pilot tested, although some of the other interactive computer tasks have been pilot tested. And so when this first came out in the NAEP, we got inspired to sort of go down this path of developing our tool, Sero, to implement this approach, but also to think more broadly about how we could use concept mapping not only at the national level for assessment, but bring it into the classroom so that teachers can make more efficient use of concept mapping. That efficiency factor has been one of the reasons why concept mapping is not used more broadly. While we know that it's used in pre-K all the way up through adult learning, and it's used all over the world, we see that in pockets. And so we don't see sort of broad implementation of concept mapping. And so with the NAEP calling for this approach, and with that efficiency factor being a challenge, we've gone down the road of developing Sero, which is our tool. We've developed Sero through a series of Department of Defense grants, actually. Department of Defense is very interested in learning and learning assessment and e-assessment, and in using these types of tools to not only assess learning, but also to assess how teams work, and then to even drive further to think about how we can perhaps automatically or semi-automatically generate assessments. And so that's our current work with the Army Research Institute, is to try to add even more efficiency to the process in terms of authoring the maps. So what I want to do now is go to the live demo and show you how Sero works. I'm going to first show you from the student perspective what this sort of thing looks like. And I actually, I'm going to use the same, one of the example maps that we see in the NAEP in order to demonstrate how to do this. So what you're looking at is what the student would see in terms of the task. And we start off by scaffolding the student to show them how Sero works and how they can create the maps using this, what we call our build-a-map approach, which is essentially that these students are provided the concepts and the linking phrases, and it's up to them to form those propositions and build out the map. This idea of scaffolding the students on the task is really important to us because if you think about it, students are very used to doing multiple choice tests or true and false tests, or even older students used to writing essays and maybe even building portfolios. Doing this kind of assessment, though, is going to be new to most students. And that's always been in the back of our head as we've been thinking about deploying this at a national level is how you actually can show students how to do the task. That scaffolding is a big part of what they'll need. So this is what students are presented with. Again, a set of concepts and a set of linking phrases. And we have tried to make this as easy as we can in terms of doing the task. So it's essentially and I'm just going to put together a couple propositions. I could go back and cheat, I guess, using the map here. Let's see, molecules can be water. So I'll make a couple that are true as well. But again, what we're trying to do is enable the students to, as simply as possible, create the map. In this case, all of the concepts and all the linking phrases should be used. I'm going to cheat again. Water can be found in living things. Water, let's see. We can allow them to change their map as well if they want to recreate a new proposition. Water is found in living things. So this is the task, essentially, is to take these concepts, these linking phrases, and answer the focus question. Again, we always start with that focus question. It provides the context and the bounds for the map. So this is the task that students will do with our build-a-map. Let me just do a couple more. Let's see, molecules have motion. And so we can allow them to build out their map. And I just want to get a couple of these right, but I'm going to leave content on the table for us to look at. We don't anticipate that students would recreate the exact structure here. I'm obviously able to see that structure, but more important to us is the propositions that they create. And so we don't restrict them in terms of where things can be put. We're much more interested in what propositions they make, what propositions they organize in order to answer that focus question. So fairly simple in terms of the execution of the task for the students. They can then submit their map. We do prompt them with, in this case, hints to show that they still have some content that's left on the table, if you will, and suggest that they might want to complete that, or we give them the option of just going forward. So in this case, they can get the immediate results, and this is essentially comparing their work to that reference map, which comprises the map that I showed you from the NAEP example. Shows them instantly which ones they got correct, which ones they're missing that were in the reference map, and which ones they got incorrect. In this case, you see an incorrect one here and lots of missing ones, obviously, because I didn't do it, but the green shows them which ones they got right. If you want to use this as a more of a formative or learning assessment for learning task, you can also show them that reference map, right? So now they have to compare what they've done to that reference map. That is one of our implementations of concept mapping. It is the one that is closest to the NAEP type of deployment. We have another approach that we've been working on as well, which is what we call our skeleton maps. So this is, again, another way to use concept mapping for assessment. In this case, what we're doing is taking that reference map and adding what we call assessment items. We have 6 different kinds of assessment items, and these are essentially taking the concept mapping process down to its elemental level and using those elemental tasks to create an assessment. So again, scaffolding the learner in terms of what they'll need to do to execute this kind of task, We have 6 different kinds. We have what we call our multiple choice item, which is select a node within the graph or a concept or linking phrase and get options for what should be filled in there. We have one that's a fill-in, which is a recall task as opposed to multiple choice, which is more of a recognition task. The fill-in suggests that they put their own content in. We have what we call a drag and drop. This takes items from outside the map and moves them in and where the learner needs to connect them in a particular place. We have an error correct item, which was inspired by some work down at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil by our friend Paulo Carrillo and his colleagues. And this introduces errors into the map and suggests that the students try to find them and correct them. We have another one, which is our connect to, where you're making those connections between concepts and linking phrases or linking phrases and concepts. And then we have our arrowhead direction, where you're determining which direction that arrowhead should point. Again, these are all just basic elements of the concept mapping process that we've now turned into a way for the student to use some content and structure that's provided to them, and then also introduce their own. So the way that this looks then, let me move my Zoom bar out of the way, is again, here's our multiple choice item. Molecules can be water. I know that one's correct. Water can change. Here's a connect to item. We can connect anywhere in the map. We'll just connect here because I think water can change to liquid. Here's a fill-in item. The student now is to recall, right? And so this is not giving them students content. They need to recall the content and figure out what needs to go here. If I recall correctly, that was molecules. Oh, no, not molecules. Let's just say things. We'll fill that in. Here's our arrowhead direction. Again, the student needs to determine which way this arrowhead should point in order to make a true proposition. These are our drag and drop items. And so students can bring in the items and figure out where they should appear in the map in order to make true propositions. And lastly, you'll notice there's one more item, our error correct item. It is not visually cued, but it is cued instead by the content of the proposition. Water only sometimes found in living things. Water is found in living things. So they find that proposition, which is incorrect, and they change it. Again, we prompt for any unanswered work. And again, immediate feedback. So the students are shown which ones they got, which one's correct and which ones they got incorrect. And then we do show them the reference map as well. So those are our 2 implementations. Again, the build-a-map and the skeleton map, with the build-a-map being closer to what the NAEP is called for. But our skeleton map gives a lot of flexibility in terms of creating interesting, engaging assessment tasks in a concept mapping format. We can vary the difficulty of the maps quite a bit, depending on the content of the map, the size of the map. In the case of the skeleton map, also vary by the kinds of assessment items that we introduce and how many we introduce, what the distractors are. So whereas the last presentation was really focused on the content of the assessment, we're also focused on the structure of the assessment. You're no longer looking at an assessment comprising a series of linear questions, which very often don't have anything to do with each other. You're now in the space of providing a much more holistic evaluation and assessment of not only what the student knows, but also enabling that assessor to look across the students to see where the misconceptions lie, what sort of trends exist in the mental models across the students in order to teach from that point, which is really a goal of concept mapping, is to ascertain what the students know and then teach from that point. I want to quickly show you, that was the student side. I want to quickly show you the teacher side of Sero, just to show you what this looks like on the other side. And I want to first show you what the results look like. This is going to be looking at a different map, which is about matter. And so what we can see is that we're able to now look at these maps and assess them and evaluate them on a couple of different levels. So the first level we can look at is across everybody, all the students. We can see what propositions generally the students got right, which ones they generally got wrong. We can, of course, then look at each individual student to see their results. But if we look at it from the meta level, if you will, the amalgamated view, we can now see consensus in terms of which propositions students are getting more right, and which ones fewer students are getting right. And so this gives us a sense, again, a snapshot view across all the students. Which of these propositions do they seem to know and know pretty clearly, and which ones are they still struggling with? We can also, again, this is the build-a-map task, because we're looking across all the students using the same components, or as I sometimes refer to them, Lego pieces. Because everybody's using the same components, we can now compare the students also to each other and give various views which indicate not only each individual student, but we can now show how close is each individual student to that master map, but also how close are they to each other. And so we can compare the students by looking again at the propositional level to show which ones they got in common with one another, and which ones they don't have in common. We see then in the sort of the bullseye chart here, then clusters of students. In this case, the example has 7 students, but you can imagine as the numbers get larger, those clusters start to take shape. So that is what this looks like from a review perspective. Quickly walk you through our authoring process. So how do molecules, again, starting with that focus question, which provides the context, molecules work. We have an option to do the scoring approach if you want to compare the students' work to your reference map. We also have some options for just providing lists of concepts if you want them to develop their own. Those, of course, we aren't yet evaluating, because the students are now introducing their own content, their own Legos, if you will. So those are harder to score, but they can provide a different kind of activity for offering this kind of approach. And so we'll do a scored here. We have a number of ways that we start the reference map building from. We can start from scratch. You can build on a prior assessment. You can use files from other concept mapping programs. In this case, I'll just pull up the one from before. Here you can edit the map. We've also been introducing some automated tools to implement what we know to be good practice for concept maps. So for instance, our structure tool here is going to point out that here's a cross-link. We know that cross-links are very good and encourage meaningful learning. So this is a good thing. We can also point out where the structure itself might have some things like fans, which are a lot of concepts that come off a single linking phrase. And the goal here is to provide guidance. It's not to automate the authoring process in terms of structure or content. It's to embed these rules of thumb about what we know good concept maps comprise. So we have a couple of tools to help that process. And then moving forward, you decide at this point whether you want to do the build a map, so give the students just concepts and linking phrases, or you want to give them a skeleton map. In this case, we also have another automated tool that allows us to have Sero look at the content, look at the structure, and suggest to you where assessment items might appear and which kinds of assessment items you might want to use. This is a huge advancement for us under our Army Research Institute work. Again, trying to get this authoring process as efficient as possible, because we're sensitive to this is a new thing. It goes way beyond multiple choice. And we realize that if we want folks to try to implement this in the classroom, we need to scaffold them with additional tools that make setting up these kinds of assessments as easy as possible. So that's a quick demo of how Sero works. Again, what we're trying to do is play within the space between giving students instruction and training them on how to create good concept maps, and then having them start from scratch, which is very insightful if you can get up that very steep hill of onboarding them, of giving them the kind of feedback and training to create good concept mapping skills. We know that creating the maps from scratch is incredibly insightful. But we also know that this they're harder to evaluate, because if you have 30, 40, 50 students, you're going to get 30, 40, 50 different concept maps. And so the trade-off is between that and in the other upper right quadrant, giving them everything, right? Giving them an entire map to read, or giving them a lot of the content. So we're trying to play sort of in the gray space here, which is using concept mapping processes, elemental processes, as well as the overall process, like in the Build-A-Map, to build out the map, to enable these kinds of assessments to be used in the classroom and at national level assessment scale. So it's a big elephant, and we're trying to cover a lot of ground here with Sero. We have a pretty mature capability to do that, but we're continuing to build. I mentioned earlier our current work with the Army Research Institute, which is focused in part on those automated support structures that I showed you, but also to try to use natural language processing to go from text into a draft concept map that the authors can then revise and turn into the kinds of map that they want to use. We've also looking at other tools, for instance, notating and highlighting tools that would allow them to quickly capture some content and get it in the map. Again, I appreciate what Ian said the other day about efficiency, but to do something of this scale and to try to introduce something as different and unique as this approach is going to take some attention to the efficiency factor. So we continue to build in some automated support for the authoring piece. We're also very interested in and have for a long time been interested in what we can call telemetry data, which is each and every action those students take. So in our skeleton map, we can think about the sequence of items, which items they answer first, which items they go back and change. And for the Build-A-Map, we can think about which propositions they're forming first, which ones they break up and reform. We're enabled to do this through XAPI, which has already been mentioned here a couple times at the conference. XAPI enables us to track each and every one of those actions. Our goal now is to do something with those data. And as you can imagine, that's voluminous data, even for a small assessment, but it really has the potential to show us trends, to show us patterns that students take through the assessments, and at a much larger scale. You can imagine those patterns enabling a lot of inferencing about what students think and how they're thinking about it. I'll close with an invitation. Everyone, of course, is welcome to register for a free Sero account. We've put a number of learning journey resources for teachers and for students, again, to sort of walk down this path of concept mapping, what it's all about. And we're very interested in continuing to engage with folks through our pilot program. Come, let us help you set up, let us engage with you to figure out how this kind of approach might work in your classrooms, in your schools, in your districts. And with that, I will close up. I invite everybody to connect with us on Twitter and also LinkedIn. And Jeff, I hope I've gotten us a bit back on track on time.
Yes. Thank you ever so much, Brian. Brian's going to be busy today. He's also chairing a session this afternoon. Done the demonstration. He'll be chairing the next session, and he's our puppet master behind the scenes, keeping all of this iceberg of a conference afloat. So I'm just going to give him 30 seconds to catch his breath before moving on to the next session, and invite you to please have a look at the concept mapping. It is breathtakingly clever idea, if I may say so, and it's one of those areas that I think is where the future of assessment lies. The path, the journey is going to be long, complicated, and probably torturous, but it's something that we need to get our heads around as an industry, as a profession. So, Brian, change of hat.
Back over to me. I see a couple questions. I'll try to get to those in the next session. But for now, let me also get our next speakers lined up. Jeff, so if you could just keep vamping for a couple minutes, I will get everybody.
I will indeed. I seem to have. There we are. So I was just trying to share my screen to move on to our next session. We're pleased to say this session that Brian will be chairing now. We have one speaker and a set of speakers. We're all looking at here is some of the interesting things that are going on around this whole area of innovation and making the technology work, making the tools and techniques work. And I'm looking forward to hearing both Christina Schneider and John Gordon Patterson, who I've known for a long time, and Thomas Edwards, give us their presentations. So if I can just stop sharing this for a moment. Sorry if my technology is being a bit clunky this morning. That's better. I'm now going to say to Brian, have you had a chance to take a drink of water, a deep breath, and a large bourbon?
I will
rocks?
when I'm dead, Jeff. We're going to move on.
Sorry, Walter shook his head then. I should have said a scotch on the rocks. I was just translating it. And as a scotch drinker, I should have kept to the scotch. Okay, over to you, Brian, and I'll leave everybody in your very capable hands again.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everybody, for joining us for this next session. We're going to have two presentations this time around. And our first one is from Christina Schneider, who is a Senior Director of Psychometrics at Cambium Assessment. And Christina, if you are ready, you may proceed. All right, Christina, we can see your slides. We just need you to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. You're good to go. Thanks.
Wonderful. So thank you for inviting me to be a part of this session. As you said, I work at Cambium Assessment, and I'm a principled assessment designer who advocates for embedding learning theory-based approaches into product development to improve the accuracy and the utility of the information we provide to teachers about where students are in their learning. And so today I'm going to talk about market research as the context and evidence to support innovation. So statewide summative assessments are often one of the most valid tools that we use to measure student learning. However, because score reports lack likely instructional actions that research evidence suggests will help students grow, and because score reports are seldom returned to teachers or parents quickly, teachers find little utility or transparency in assessment results. And so there are increasing calls from the field for assessments to better serve teachers and students by being more instructionally useful. There are a cadre of assessment designers who purport that the use of principled assessment design is key to creating instructionally useful information from assessments, but this is yet to take off across the industry. Therefore, there's a tension among what users desire, what buyers, for example, states or districts describe as their needs in their RFPs, the existing infrastructure, capacity, and test development processes that are currently used across different organizations, and the decision-making processes used in the industry that sometimes privilege opinions and organizational constraints as the main decision-making driver of innovation. I advocate for principled assessment design based in range achievement level descriptors. Range achievement level descriptors represent likely pathways or benchmarks in which student learning unfolds when they are built to describe the content that students can do, the cognitive complexity with which students are thinking about that content, and context, which is the conditions under which students can show you what they know. And when content, cognitive complexity, and context are embedded into the range ALDs based on state standards and merged with evidence from the learning science literature, they become a theory of learning consistent with definitions of learning progressions found in the learning science literature. Range ALDs, built to function as learning progressions, can be a bridge that connects an assessment system to teaching and learning when there is evidence to show that the test score interpretations that we are providing are reasonably true. Range ALDs can help teachers understand where the student is currently in their learning, with the next stage of the progression representing the likely opportunity to learn the student needs next. They show the characteristics of the types of instructional experiences and practice opportunities and task characteristics the student needs next to grow. In this example, you're seeing a range ALD centered on standards, but also using evidence from the learning science community that suggests that where evidence is located in a text and the amount of evidence that's used relates to how difficult a question is for a student. This holds implications for teachers understanding how to direct questions strategically to students in different stages of reading comprehension. In order to have this vision and innovation, we need to persistently embed item to range ALD alignment through the test development cycle. We are resequencing historic test development processes to streamline the work of assessment development for efficacy, efficiency, coherence, and instructional utility. The first step of streamlining is to take the development of range ALDs, which historically occurs in step 7, just before standard setting, and moving them up to the first step of the process because they are the skill score interpretations. We are building items to range ALDs, and we have evidence that we're doing this when we see the range ALDs as the task demands and item writing specifications, and items tagged to the range ALDs and item management systems. This then allows step 3, where blueprints and item development plans may be centered on these statements. We field test items in step 4, and then in step 5, we can immediately begin validating the range ALDs. Range ALDs are often a set of hypotheses. We may use evidence from learning science along with teacher and item writer expertise to inform the range ALD progressions, but you may not have research available for every single standard. So creators are engaging in hypotheses. At stage 5, we're hypothesis testing using an embedded standard setting algorithm. What do we do when we discover, or if we discover, that teachers think content becomes increasingly more sophisticated and difficult, yet the data from the students suggests that the opposite is true and in fact is becoming more easier? We engage in the iteration process by editing the range ALDs based on what we've learned from student data. And we go back into step 1 and step 2, and we rework the progressions and the item writing specifications based on this work. Now let's look at common blockers to this process in the industry. This is a significant change of process for content experts. It's historically more common to have items written to standards than to have items written to progressions within a standard. And so item writers are experts at working with writing items to standard in a very routinized manner that they find efficient. And when we ask them to change their process, this can be especially difficult when they're placed under extremely stressful timelines and with limited resources, because the iteration processes we're talking about may create additional work steps. and they may have had some difficult processes with the iteration before. This also affects the cost of a project for a single division, even if this framework results in net cost savings downstream. A company has to work together across divisions to think about costs. Otherwise, you have one division that has an idea to drive innovation, another division that has labor constraints, and another division that has different opinions about what's useful for teachers with no process to help resolve these tensions. Instructionally useful assessments have to have score interpretations that are reasonably true. And in this graphic, you are looking at items along a test scale, and if students got items correct or incorrect. We should be seeing a pattern of solid red to solid green to solid blue if items aligned to the progressions are working correctly. Here we see that the earlier stage of the progression in red, it's functioning similarly to our expectations. But in the messy middle and in the advanced stage, the item to align progressions intermixed, meaning we're not giving accurate information to teachers about what students in the middle and the high end know and can do. If you do not have evidence that fixing this issue is useful and has value to stakeholders, you likely don't have convincing evidence for other part of your organization who has different pain points. Therefore, it's important for an organization to determine if business as usual is delivering the same potential value to stakeholders as the proposed innovation. This is the why for market research. What is the evidence to support the innovation is useful and has value to stakeholders? What's the evidence that business as usual is delivering the same potential value as the innovation? Is it worth 2 to 3% of a projected project's budget to empirically discover its value prior to adding it to the roadmap if there are different perspectives in your organization? Or is it better to spend money creating a solution that may not solve fundamental issues in the industry? Market research can inform decisions about where to place an organization's precious resources. I'm going to show you a study that I conducted with a vice president of product management and a research associate, where we looked at this problem together, in particular for creating an NGSS assessment. Together, we surveyed a nationally representative sample of buyers and users. In our study, buyers were district stakeholders who contribute to the decision-making process of which assessments to buy. Users were the teachers who were tasked with taking the assessment data and changing their instruction. What we found is that both district stakeholders and teachers believe that assessment design should be based on research evidence about how students learn. And for reporting, feedback on student achievement should be based on the actual item content that individual students took, much like teachers review what students know and can do in the classroom. This is also particularly important for understanding where a child is in a learning progression. We learned that 73% of buyers found a system that provides scale scores and validated learning progressions to be the most important quality of an assessment based on those we posed, and that they believe that implementing the learning progressions as part of reporting could support not only next instructional steps, but also help teachers to better understand how to differentiate content attributes for students. 89% of buyers indicated that it was important that items be designed using research evidence about how students learn. For example, having students write, such as in a constructed response item, helps students transfer their learning into their long-term memory. It's our job to help put such research into practice so that assessments are not only a measure of learning, but they also support learning. Now let's look at if business as usual was worth maintaining. Only 20% of teachers are confident in large-scale assessments that use standard industry practice. That is, only 20% of teachers support maintaining business as usual when we're building an NGSS assessment. Whereas we found 73% of buyers found a system that provides both scale scores and validated learning progressions to be one of the most important features of an assessment. Thus, using PAD to develop new assessment appears to solve a problem that buyers are aware that teachers have. If buyers are interested in such a framework, they only need to ask for it by name if they want the measurement industry to move faster. Here in this graphic, we are checking if items measuring different stages of learning are increasing in difficulty on a test. Items increase in difficulty across the test scale as the stages of learning increase, denoted by the red, yellow, and blue areas on the graphic. And you can see that the next red, yellow, and blue boxes also increase in difficulty as grade increases for a reading assessment. So what's next? Well, for one thing, we can't just call victory and say, okay, now we're going to implement this process without additional innovations layered into the process. How do we make it efficient for content experts to iterate in ways that incorporate feedback loops in places where items are easier or more difficult than expected? This is learning science. We need to update systems to allow dynamic score reporting based on range ALDs and the actual items that students took based on whether students answered them correctly or incorrectly. Mastery of standards means students have integrated content from other standards at levels of complexity in particular contexts. Within a unit of instruction, students need adaptation of tasks to the next higher stage of learning to grow. We need to support teachers by being more transparent in what growth to proficiency looks like, so they can provide students sufficient and just right opportunities to learn. Market research provides evidence from the field that assessment buyers and users desire us to implement these types of processes in our work. If you're interested in the research upon which this presentation was based, you can find it in these locations. And if you're interested in talking, you can find me on LinkedIn, on my website, on Twitter, and as always, at my work email at Cambium Assessment. Thank you so much for inviting me to share.
Thanks, Christina. That's really great stuff. I think we'll have you hold on to the end and then take questions at that point. But this is really great. I think more of this sort of thing is needed. And a question for you to prepare for later is when we are talking about capabilities that perhaps the buyers can't even imagine yet. I'm curious to hear about your thoughts on how we gather those kinds of data and how we help them sort of envision a new world. So so keep that one in your back pocket, but we'll come back to you at the end of the next presentation. All right, Walter and John Gordon are up next. They will be talking to us about developing a teacher workforce at speed, scale, and across territories. John Gordon is from e-learning entrepreneur and consultant. He is an e-learning entrepreneur and consultant. And Walter Patterson comes to us from the Walter Patterson Consultancy, where he is a principal consultant. So, gentlemen, the floor is all yours.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Or is it still morning there? This afternoon, Walter and I are going to tell you a story, a project that we've been working in over the past few years. Walter, can you fire up the presentation, go back to start? So around about 2018, we were invited to work with a Chinese company called Akatsu, short for Academic Society. They were a large-scale ESL company teaching young children in China. They were teaching them one-to-one online. And if you think of China, you think of large numbers of people, large numbers of children, large numbers of teachers. The mission of this company was to grow their teacher workforce over the next 6 or 7 years to roughly 100,000 tutors. But they had to do it within a context where there's quite a lot of government control. So also the next slide, please. So we're looking to train teachers. We expect them to be in the US, UK, Slovenia, interestingly, but mostly in the Philippines. And that was good for time zones, where we get Filipino tutors teaching Chinese children roughly the same time zone. And they were looking for large numbers of tutors, large numbers of students. Next slide, please. Then we're given a little problem. Late in 2018, the company was growing well, and tutors were being recruited all across the world with all sorts of qualifications, and indeed some not very useful qualifications. But now they were told they had to have a 120-hour TFL course accredited from a recognized international institution. Each tutor had to have a bachelor's degree from a recognized university, and he also had to pass a criminal background check. At that time, Acaso had 20,000 tutors, and they needed to be accredited as quickly as possible. So could you move on, Walter? Now that's a problem, because as soon as you try to accredit teacher training, you're not only checking knowledge and understanding, you also have to check professional practice. So we knew we could use Moodle or any other VLE to do the teaching of the knowledge and understanding. We knew we could use exam systems, and ASA had their own, but we could also use things like Moodle to do that. Teacher observation would be a difficult one. Now, luckily, Acaso had a QA system which was well established. And over the past 10 years, or the previous 10 years, it spent a lot of time observing teachers in practice. Whenever a tutor looked for a progression in their career, they had to go through a set of observations. When they were recruited, they had to be observed. If there was an issue with a student, the tutors had to observe. And over those years, they developed what we call their OTAF system, Online Tutor Assessment Form. This is just a standard format that a tutor assessor or a tutor manager could complete based on viewing a 15 or a 20-minute teaching session. And they've done many thousands of these, and over time established quite a reasonable view of how to assess whether a teacher was behaving professionally or not. So we thought we could use that as a core of our professional practice. And we designed a certificate in TESOL, along with Centis, and we started to put that together. Next slide, Walter. So we started to roll this thing out. Everything we did was as standard as is possible. So the learning content was designed as a set of Google books. The exams were Google quizzes. Our professional assessment was a set of learner observation made by Acaso tutor managers. So we ran our first pilot. We went out to the Philippines. We did this all face-to-face with real tutors and taught them. We tested all the paperwork as fast as we could. We tested the exams, and we got 30 tutors through the Ascentis qualification. That same summer, we did an online pilot with 100 tutors. And if you notice the date, this is summer 18. And we hit the bricks when the government came in with their new rule that things had to. So when we had to do it by speed. And so over the period 2019 to 20, we successfully managed to get up 5,000 tutors through the Ascentis course. And the following year it dropped to 17. But at that time we had trained everyone in the company. Now we had one significant advantage. If a tutor failed the exam, they lost the job. So that worked well. We were very pleased with that. 100% of the staff were now accredited to work in China. And then our team was given a more interesting problem. And we were told, asked, can you develop a certificate, make it available to all ESL teachers in China? Now, this is to teach or to train teachers in classrooms across China who would be teaching traditionally from an English textbook, groups of 20, 30, 60, 80, 100 students at a time. Now, we're told we want that to be accredited in the UK, as there was the other one. And it was viewed as part of the company's social responsibility, putting something back into China. Now, the drivers in this were not academics, they weren't the businessmen, it was the investors. They wanted to see something coming back from this project and back into the country. What they told us, you've got to do it at very low cost. And we're also told this would only come out of the marketing budget, come out of future revenues. We had to build to a cost, the scale. So next slide, Will. So we had new issues. We had a working system for one-to-one teaching. We could do that quite well. But now when we started to address the problem of teachers in classrooms in China, we had to try and teach them how to plan a lesson and how we were going to assess that. How we were going to do professional practice observation, recruit a team of people and start putting them in cars and drive around the country, talking about a large number of people. At that time, there was approximately 3 million ESL teachers in China, all of which could do with some international training. And the last problem was how do we get these teachers to engage in reflective practice, and how do we assess that? None of these things were simple. Even the simple parts, MCQs, they gave us tech problems. We could use Moodle as before, but now we're using very large numbers of assessment. So we would end up with a large number of Moodle instances to manage. With a lot of real, quite hard technology to fix. Exams this time had to be bilingual. All the rubrics would be in Chinese if the answers are in English. All the feedback, anything would be in both English and in Chinese. So we had problems. It also gave us a problem in accreditation. Our accreditors in England also had to have some measure of bilinguality. Next slide. So we had to build some new technology. We had to have a tool that would let an expert design a lesson example, a lesson test for a potential tutor. We had to have some sort of intelligent tool that would allow a trainee teacher to build lesson plans in a kind of manner. We had to have scripts around that would allow us to assess discussion forums, get people to talk and reflect on the lesson plans, on their lessons. We needed to have technology to store this stuff. We were talking about a large number of videos. We had to have a mechanism to an assessor, a mechanism to allow them to watch what's going on in the class, mark up a nota form, and to. So we built a kind of complicated integrated system. We kept Moodle. We kept that as a tool for managing everything. So we could take large numbers of potential or our system, break them into what we call study groups, typically groups of 10 people. Those study groups were broken into pairs by groups of 2. And we could manage their timetables using Moodle happily. To get lesson planning work, we had to make new technology. We had to be able to get from an expert an exercise that a student could carry out, which would allow them to develop a lesson plan assessed automatically. So similar to the previous speaker, we built what we were calling decision trees. So we saw a lesson plan as being something like a decision tree where students could, given an exercise, given a scenario that they could design a lesson for, and would make a lot of choices. They would say, is the size of the classroom matter, or so on. But what we wanted our expert to do was not only to design an exercise, but to design every possible piece of feedback that the student would require. And we built a tool to manage that. We then had to have another tool that allowed us to manage the actual teaching. We decided, in collaboration with our assessor, that we would accept 15-minute videos showing excerpts from lessons that trainee teacher could make. But we had a lot of them. For every certificate, we required an hour's worth of teaching, some 4 15-minute videos. And we've got tens of thousands of students with a lot of video space. So we needed technology for that. To look at reflective practice, we decided to use Moodle forums. So within a Moodle forum, we put a time frame around it, put a structured discussion on, and Walter will talk later. Did a little bit of science out of that. We then made another app, which we gave to the assessor. I get mixed up with all these names. We gave the OTA farm to the assessor, who would score the video, look at the lesson plan, and look at the discussion forum. From Moodle, we put all the exams in for all the teaching and learning, all the knowledge and understanding. We pulled those together to a single store, which we could then compose into a spreadsheet sent to England, which formed the basis for the assessment in England. Now that's rather a complicated diagram that represents probably the best part of a year's work by a team in China, and the team in the UK with about half a dozen guys over here are working together to build this. And I'm going to pass over to Walter here to describe how some of these bits work. Okay.
Thank you, John. I don't seem to be getting my slide to move on. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Walter.
Yeah. For some reason, my slide deck is not moving on. Oh, there we go. Thank you very much. Yeah, so as John said, the first challenge was to create a tool that enabled trainees to build a lesson plan that would provide them with auto-generated feedback on the lesson plan, along with an assessment score. And the tool would also automatically save the lesson plan to provide material for the online forum discussion with their peers. The other tool that we needed to build was the one that would allow the TEFL lesson expert to build the scenario and to populate the feedback and the scoring. In the next slide, I'll show you how a typical scenario would be built up. But the attributes of each 15-minute lesson would be things like the timing of the beginning, middle, and end phases of the lesson. What were the language objectives? What grammar and vocabulary would be introduced and practiced? What resources would be required, such as textbooks, games, videos? Is there going to be any peer or group work in this session? Or is there going to be any formative assessment, and so on? So in this slide, you'll see that the tool that was offered to the TEFL expert allowed them to select a theme for a lesson and a level. So for example, one of the options there would be to have a lesson at level 2, P2, that allowed pupils to talk about their day. And what the assessor would then do was begin to flesh out the detail of the scenario in sufficient detail to allow the trainee to make a good plan. So then in the tool, the TEFL expert would select one of the tabs from the top there. You know, what's the target language? What's the learning strategy and, teaching strategy, lesson stages and procedures, and so on. And then within any one of those attributes, they would offer the candidate, the trainee, a limited set of options from which they could construct their lesson, along with the possible feedback. So you'll see in this case that if they omitted to fill in a selection here, the feedback would be that they had, in fact, omitted to do that. If they selected the last one here, which is that we're going to use a variety of phrases, the feedback would be to question whether that was appropriate for a level 2. And finally, as John has said, for every combination of these attributes in this scenario design, there would be an allocated score by the TEFL expert. And all of that would be presented then in the tool to the trainee in order to begin planning their lesson. At the very end, of course, we have to make that available. So the lesson plan generator tool then took that whole scenario with all of the information and it placed it into Moodle so that it could be deployed for use in the assessment process. John also mentioned that we need evidence of reflective practice, and that's going to come from a discussion forum. The forum is made up of pairs, 5 pairs of trainees in each group of 10. They will each post links to their lesson plan along with its feedback and their lesson video, and begin a dialogue with their peers and other students in their group. So what we were capturing here was there's some detail of the forum discussion, but we also required the metrics provided by Moodle from the forum activity. So the assessor would look at that detail and say, does that look like a meaningful, professional and reflective discussion? So that was important, that we weren't just going to use the metrics that we get from Moodle, as you'll see here, but we were also going to moderate that by asking the assessor to give a 0 or a 1, depending on its meaningfulness. So we've also included in the metric, of course, things like the number of posts, the number of responses, how many assessments, how many attachments were put up, and how many views were there. And that gave us a very rough metric that we were using for that. And that score was logged in the Moodle system. But we've got assessors that are going to be key to this process. They're going to be looking at the 15-minute videos of the lessons. They're going to be looking at the lesson plan. They're going to be thinking about the discussion forum as well. So we needed a tool that would allow them to have all of that at their fingertips. And as John has said, that was developed in Chinese. And for reasons that John will tell you in a moment, that was not released. But here's a mock-up of what it looked like. There would be the OTAF completion window, and then the assessor was then able to switch to the video window to look at a segment in the lesson, to look at the lesson plan to see where that was occurring and what was planned for that section, and then to look at any discussion that there might have been about that lesson plan and its execution. So it's worthwhile just saying at this point that we also had to develop an assessor qualification so that we were going to have, thousands of assessors that we needed to make this work. Back to you, John.
Okay, so this is running in 2021. We had 100 trainees in Hong Kong, and the first graduation was just last year. We had 60 graduates with a lovely ceremony. Everything was working. The TESOL, the normal company system was working well. We were training 3,000–4,000 every month. We'd guaranteed our English compatriots that we'd be giving them 15,000 registrations a month. And Walter, the next slide. Next slide, Walter. So it stopped again. Anyway, the next slide actually just says right in the middle of it, it was a disaster. The Chinese government outlawed the for-profit tutoring practices. So after stroke, TESOL research, November last year, everything's working fine. And now it's trying to work out what to do next. If you could click on, Walter. You went back on the wrong direction. There you go. Fine. We're continuing with adult teaching and we're developing new products. And the things that we're looking at now is using TikTok as a platform, looking at a global non-Chinese marketplace, still to decide whether we're teaching children or adults. And that's it. So we did the project, trained the whole workforce in time. We had a stab at training the whole of the Chinese workforce, but didn't quite make it. Thank you very much for listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing sharing the story, and in particular your honesty. We're often not used to seeing presentations that include a slide that says the whole thing was a disaster. So I definitely appreciate the honesty. So while you all have a chance to catch up, I do want to get Christina back. She's back, and kind of pitch that question again, Christina. So again, as we think about market research, we can sort of think about user needs and that sort of thing. But sometimes that also means helping those potential customers to kind of envision a world that doesn't currently exist. And I'm curious, given kind of the theme of our conference being the context for innovation, if you have suggestions for how do you and your colleagues help the community kind of envision that world that doesn't yet exist?
Well, so one of the ways that we did that in the market research is we built prototypes for folks to review so that they went to different segments, so that as we were asking for their feedback, we were also showing them what these things meant so that they got a little bit more context for what we were thinking. So wireframing and prototyping is definitely helpful. And then I think in my experience of doing this work, gosh, for 20 years, you have to be persistent and share that vision over time, and slowly you get interest in that innovation.
Examples in time sounds like a tried and true strategy. Great. So Walter and John, two questions for you in the chat. So the first was data security an issue for you in your project, and then also just curious about the broader context. So was the government decision a fallout from COVID or an international decision by the government? What was kind of underlying that?
Well, security, well, GDPR is a big thing to start with. We could only have a restricted set of data that went from China to England for the purposes of the registration and accreditation. We could not touch any data where children were involved, so video security was very difficult.
Yeah.
And none of that data left China ever. Just to be secure, so that never crossed the border. The data, we did have one terrible data problem right at the beginning when we upgraded Moodle, and one of our texts we got to back up the database. But luckily we were only a few thousand students in and we could recover again, but we lost everything. If that happened 3 years in, it would have been really interesting. So data security was very difficult for us, but we managed it. And we were very, very careful. What was the other question?
On the Chinese government pulling the plug and changing the rules every 2 years.
Well, there was a process. The it was Wild West at the beginning, and then gradually restrictions came in to improve the quality of teaching, and gradually restrictions, and not just English language teaching that was restricted, all online after school teaching. And the other things that were restricted was children's access to internet anywhere. So there was a Chinese policy across the board to try and reduce the amount of time kids are spending online. But nothing to do with COVID.
Yeah.
Or international, it was an internal Chinese government decision.
I'm curious. Yeah, I was also curious. You said your diagram was complex. It looked extremely complex, and I was sort of wondering, you know, as you described it, you said we built a lot of things. I was kind of curious, coming from the other side, what was the sort of infrastructure you were plugging into, if any, and then, you know, getting that group of teachers to understand what you're trying to do, and even just, you know, buttonology sort of things with regard to the technology. What do those training requirements look like?
Well, the Chinese research department with something like 30 young researchers. When I moved in, joined them, I increased the average age dramatically. And when Walter came in as well, he did the same. But the general age were young graduates in their mid-20s did most of the heavy lifting on all the development side. For the basic technology on this side, we were using AWS for all our server technology. We had to shift that into Alibaba when we moved over into China. We used Moodle on this side, and we had a lot of problems getting Chinese versions of that running as well. If Thomas had been here, he would tell you all the technology involved in making the tools, but they were mostly built in the UK using standard software. The hard stuff was all database, and trying to manage large numbers, trying to render stuff out to scale on time and making it live. Balancing the data was not easy. Even the video storage system was awful. We were trying YouTube for a while as a video store. That gave us problems. We ended up with a Chinese public video system. That's why we'll probably shift over to TikTok going in rather than YouTube.
Yeah.
Well, if you look at the record within Moodle, you'll see a lot of links. So each student record would have linked for all their lesson plans and their videos and the questions.
Massive data.
Yep.
Christina, I'll kind of give you the last word, Christina, and have you think sort of about the broader context of introducing innovation. You mentioned earlier sort of prototypes and time. For a lot of organizations that are trying to introduce innovation that don't necessarily have the resources, maybe they're a small development team, maybe they've got a great idea. Wondering if you have any sort of guerrilla tactics that you might suggest to those folks to try to get that same kind of engagement and conversation going that you were able to get. Again, for folks who are lesser resourced.
Well, I think you can spend a lot of time in either a large or a small organization if you don't have everybody rowing in the same direction. So I think it's really important to engage in processes where there's disciplined dissent, but then you get everybody in the boat, and the leader really has to have a vision for everybody working together and knowing how you contribute to that vision and innovation, and what are the checkpoints that you know that you're making progress and getting feedback along the time, so that as you're developing, you also have planned feedback loops so that you know if you have to go into another direction or not with your stakeholders.
Excellent. So it sounds like the big organizations have the same problems the small organizations are going to have same challenges. Well, great. This has been very enlightening, and especially to sort of capture views from different parts of the world, and we have a very international audience, and we're very proud of that. But also, I think it's such important learning that we can capture, no matter what our corner of the world is, just from seeing what other folks are doing and how successful they're being, and getting that kind of guidance. So appreciate the panel. We are going to, at this time, go on a break. We will be back at 12:45 Eastern and resume the rest of the afternoon. Thanks again, everybody.